The door closes at midnight. Inside the chamber, candles throw shadows against silk walls. The smell of rosewater cannot mask the scent of fear. A young woman sits on the edge of a bed she did not choose, in a room she will not leave until morning. Outside, courtiers wait in the corridor. They will wait until they hear proof. This is not a wedding night, this is an audit. In 6 hours, the proof must be presented, or the contract becomes void. In 3 minutes, you will understand why this moment was never truly private, and why the door was never truly closed. Let us return to the beginning. If stories buried in institutional records interest you, consider subscribing. In 1679, a woman named Marie-Françoise de Rochechouart arrived at Versailles. She was 17. Her family had chosen well. Her bloodline was impeccable. Her education was thorough. She had been trained in music, dancing, and the careful art of saying nothing when questioned. The court ledgers recorded her arrival on a Thursday. They recorded her assigned quarters. They recorded the cost of her initial wardrobe, paid by the crown. What they did not record was that from the moment she entered those gates, her body was no longer entirely her own. Versailles was not merely a palace, it was a machine. Every corridor had a function. Every room had a designated purpose. Every person had a role. The Sun King presided over it all, but the machine operated through thousands of smaller mechanisms. Sumptuary laws dictated which fabrics a woman could wear based on her proximity to power. Etiquette manuals prescribed the exact depth of a curtsy depending on the rank of the person being greeted. There were rules for sitting, for standing, for speaking, for remaining silent. These were not suggestions, they were the terms of survival. Marie-Françoise learned quickly. She learned that visibility was both currency and trap. To be noticed by the king meant favor. To be noticed by the king meant surveillance. She learned that other women were not companions, but competitors, each one calculating the same narrow path between obscurity and destruction. She learned that every conversation was witnessed, every letter could be opened, every private moment could become public scandal if it served someone's purpose. The historical record shows that women at absolutist courts developed what one scholar calls performative compliance. They became actresses in a theater that never closed. Smile, but not too broadly. Speak, but never first. Display learning, but never more than the man you address. Show devotion, but never demand devotion in return. The margin between acceptable behavior and ruin was thin enough to cut skin. Pregnancy was surveilled. Menstruation was tracked. A lady-in-waiting who missed her monthly cycle would find herself questioned by physicians employed by the crown. The concern was not her health. The concern was legitimacy, bloodlines, inheritance. A bastard child could destabilize alliances. A barren wife could void a contract. The female body was not private property. It was state infrastructure. Letters from Marie-Françoise's contemporary, Madame de Maintenon, suggest the psychological architecture of this existence. She writes, with careful ambiguity, of the necessity of perfect submission in all matters. She describes a world where refusal was not an option, only the manner of acceptance, where a woman's virtue was defined not by her choices, but by her capacity to endure what was required of her without visible complaint. In 1685, the Edict of Fontainebleau revoked Protestant rights in France. Women of Protestant families faced a choice that was not a choice: convert or lose everything. Your children would be taken, your property would be seized, your name would be stricken from legal documents. Hundreds of women stood in churches and spoke words they did not believe to protect what they loved. This was called mercy. This was called the king's benevolence. In neat columns their names appear: converted, reconciled, returned to the true faith. No clerk bothered to note what they said in the darkness of their rooms after the ceremony ended. There were women who resisted. The archives hold fragments of their stories. In 1698, a noblewoman named Charlotte de Saisseval refused an arranged marriage. The court documents describe her as obstinate and unreasonable. They describe her father's legal petition to have her confined to a convent. The petition was granted. Charlotte was removed from her home by officers of the crown. She was 22. She would remain behind convent walls for 16 years until her father's death released her from his authority. A single line in the ledger marks her entry: placement for correction of character. The convent was not always a refuge. It was often a prison with a religious veneer. Women sent there for correction lived under rules designed to break resistance. Silence was enforced for hours each day. Letters were read by the Mother Superior before being sent. Visitors required permission. The intent was clear: isolation produces compliance. Loneliness is an effective teacher. Scholars examining convent records from this period note patterns. Women who entered by choice wrote frequently to family. Women who entered by force wrote rarely, and when they did, their letters contained formulaic expressions of contentment. I am at peace here. God's will be done. I submit to the wisdom of my family. The language of acceptance was taught, line by line, until it sounded like the woman's own voice. But wait. Step back from individual stories and observe the structure. This was not chaos. This was not the random cruelty of violent men. This was a system with legal foundations, religious justifications, and bureaucratic procedures. When a woman was confined to a convent, there was paperwork. When a marriage was annulled due to her failure to consummate, there were witnesses who testified in ecclesiastical courts. When a woman's property passed to male relatives upon her widowhood, there were probate records detailing the transfer. Every act of control had a document. Every document had a seal. Every seal represented the state's approval. The Parlement of Paris maintained files on women deemed problematic. The criteria were broad enough to encompass almost anything: refusal to marry, refusal to enter a convent, refusal to accept a husband's mistress under the same roof, public disagreement with a male relative, excessive learning, insufficient piety, too much piety in the wrong direction. The files grew thick. Each one contained letters from family members requesting intervention. Each one contained reports from priests or physicians. Each one led to the same outcome: confinement, forced marriage, or legal erasure. Legal erasure was particularly efficient. A woman who defied her family could be declared civilly dead. Her name would be removed from inheritance documents. Her marriage could be annulled retroactively. Her children could be declared illegitimate. This was not metaphor. This was law. A woman could be alive and breathing and yet not exist in any legal sense. She became a ghost in her own life. Marie-Françoise navigated this system for 40 years. She bore children when required. She maintained silence when questioned. She attended Mass daily, sat for portraits, smiled at ambassadors, and never once wrote a letter that contradicted the official narrative of her contentment. When she died in 1715, official eulogies praised her gentle obedience and wifely virtue. Clerks listed her assets. They listed her surviving children. They did not list the nights she spent sleepless, the pregnancies that ended in stillbirth, the years of performing a life she did not choose. The truly efficient systems do not require constant violence. They require the threat of violence, held at a distance, but always visible. They require witnesses. They require examples. Every woman at Versailles knew the story of women who had refused. Every woman knew what happened to them. That knowledge did not need to be repeated. It was simply there, part of the air they breathed. Anthropologists studying court culture identify what they call ambient coercion. The pressure is everywhere and nowhere. No one threatens you directly, but you understand from 1,000 small signals that certain behaviors lead to ruin. You learn to police yourself. You learn to internalize the rules so deeply that obedience feels like choice. You smile when you curtsy because it would not occur to you to do otherwise. That is the perfection of control, when the subject believes she is acting freely while performing exactly as required. There were, of course, consequences for the men who designed these systems. None. The king who revoked Protestant rights died in his bed, surrounded by priests who assured him of his place in heaven. The fathers who confined their daughters to convents were celebrated as responsible patriarchs. The husbands who demanded absolute submission were praised for maintaining household order. The ecclesiastical courts that annulled marriages on the testimony of paid witnesses faced no scrutiny. The system rewarded its architects. And what of the women who complied, who performed obedience so skillfully that they survived? The letters that remain suggest a particular form of damage. Women who spent decades navigating absolutist courts developed what physicians of the era called nervous disorders. Tremors, sleeplessness, mysterious pains that had no physical cause, sudden collapses at public events. Physicians documented symptoms. They did not describe cause. But the pattern is clear. The body keeps score even when the mind learns to submit. In the margins of a prayer book owned by Marie Françoise, archivists found a single sentence scratched in faint pencil. The handwriting matches hers. The sentence reads, "I remember what I was before I learned to be silent." Below it, someone, perhaps Marie Françoise herself, perhaps a daughter or granddaughter, had written a response. We all do. The prayer book passed through 4 generations of women before being donated to a museum. The sentence remained. There were women who found ways to survive without becoming complicit. Some entered convents by choice and used the separation from male authority to pursue learning. Some became patrons of artists and writers, wielding influence through culture rather than politics. Some formed alliances with other women, networks of support that operated beneath official notice. These strategies required intelligence, patience, and an understanding that power was never direct. It was always oblique, always coded, always deniable. A letter from 1702 describes one such network. The writer, a minor noblewoman, describes afternoon gatherings in a private salon. The room smelled of ink and tobacco. Women sat in circles, reading aloud from banned texts smuggled in under embroidered shawls. They discussed philosophy. They debated theology. When footsteps approached in the corridor, the books disappeared into hidden compartments, and suddenly they were simply women at needlework, discussing nothing more dangerous than the quality of imported silk. The letter never names the participants. It never specifies the location. It survives only because it was intercepted and filed as suspicious correspondence by someone who understood exactly what was being protected. But even these strategies had limits. A woman could become educated, but she could not teach at a university. A woman could become wealthy, but she could not control her own money if she was married. A woman could become influential, but she could not hold office. The walls were movable, but they were still walls. The same mechanisms operated in Berlin, Vienna, Madrid, St. Petersburg. The structures varied in detail, but not in function. Absolute monarchy required absolute control over reproduction, inheritance, and legitimacy. That control required the subjugation of women's autonomy. It required surveillance. It required systems that turned potential resistance into compliance through a combination of incentive and threat. It required documentation so that every transaction was recorded and every defiance was punished according to procedure. Frederick the Great of Prussia maintained detailed files on noblewomen at his court. The files noted their fertility, their political connections, their religious affiliations, their temperaments. When arranging marriages for state purposes, he consulted these files the way a general consults maps before battle. The women were terrain. Their bodies were strategic assets. Their preferences were irrelevant data. One file, belonging to a woman named Wilhelmine von Lichtenau, contains an unusual note. In the 1770s, Wilhelmine refused a marriage arranged by the king. The file records the refusal. It records the king's response: confinement to her family estate under guard. It records the duration, 18 months. Then it records her acceptance of the marriage. The final entry reads, "Matter resolved, compliance achieved." That phrase appears in dozens of files across the archive. Compliance achieved. Not agreement, not consent, compliance. The cost of compliance appeared in forms that official ledgers never tracked. Historians examining private correspondence from this era find patterns of depression, women describing themselves as hollow or mechanical, illnesses that began after forced marriages and persisted for years, wills that left possessions to convents or charities, explicitly excluding the husbands who survived them, silent protests, posthumous, easily ignored. And here is the mechanism that should disturb you most. None of this required extraordinary cruelty. It required ordinary people doing their jobs. The priest who recorded the forced conversion was following canon law. The physician who testified to a woman's infertility was providing expert testimony. The magistrate who signed the confinement order was enforcing paternal rights as defined by statute. The convent that accepted women for correction was performing a recognized social service. Each person in the chain could claim they were simply following procedure, and they were. That is how systems of oppression function. They distribute responsibilities so widely that no individual feels accountable. The genius of the system was its ability to make resistance seem unreasonable. A woman who refused to marry was not defending her autonomy. She was selfish and obstinate. A woman who questioned her husband's authority was not asserting her dignity. She was hysterical and ungovernable. A woman who sought education was not pursuing knowledge. She was unwomanly and dangerous. The system provided the language to dismiss dissent before it could articulate itself. This language persisted long after absolute monarchies fell. You can trace its echoes through centuries, in legal systems that denied women property rights into the 20th century, in medical establishments that diagnosed female anger as mental illness, in social structures that insisted a woman's proper role was submission to male authority, whether father, husband, or state. The monarchy ended. The mechanisms survived. Archives from the dissolution of the French monarchy contain inventories of abandoned palaces. The inventories reveal hundreds of women's letters, never sent. They had been intercepted by household staff, read by security officials, and filed away as potential evidence of disloyalty. Most contain nothing scandalous. They contain loneliness. They contain expressions of homesickness, of fear, of exhaustion. They contain the private thoughts of women who were never allowed privacy. The letters remained sealed in their envelopes, addressed to mothers, sisters, friends who never knew they had been written. One letter, written by a woman whose name was redacted from the archive, contains this line: "I have learned to sleep with my eyes open and dream with my mouth closed." Another, from an Italian noblewoman married into the French court, describes watching other women. "We are like birds in different cages, singing to reassure ourselves we are still alive." These letters were found in a single box, labeled "Confiscated Materials, Female Correspondence, Uncertain Disposition." The box held 243 letters spanning 30 years. Not one had been delivered. The physical evidence tells its own story. Archaeological excavations of palace grounds have uncovered items buried in gardens, hidden in walls, concealed beneath floorboards. Jewelry, small amounts of money, documents with signatures scratched out. These were escape caches, plans for a future that never arrived. Evidence that some women never stopped hoping for a way out, even as they performed compliance every day. And what of the women who were erased entirely? Gaps appear everywhere in the archives, entries that begin with a woman's name and end mid-sentence, pages torn from ledgers, files that reference other files that no longer exist. Some gaps are explained by fire, by flood, by the simple decay of paper over centuries. But some gaps are too precise to be accidental. The bureaucrats of absolute monarchies understood that certain stories were better left untold. When a noblewoman died under suspicious circumstances, the death was recorded as natural causes. When a wife disappeared into a convent and never emerged, the record stated pious retirement. When a daughter was disowned for refusing marriage, her name was removed from family genealogies as though she had never been born. Erasure was policy. The most complete erasure was silence about what these systems cost the women who endured them. The official histories celebrate the grandeur of absolute courts. They detail the architecture, the art, the military campaigns, the diplomatic achievements. They mention women as decorative elements or as vehicles for producing heirs. They do not mention the surveillance, the coercion, the systematic destruction of autonomy presented as social order. But silence is never total. In museum collections across Europe, there are artifacts that tell the suppressed story. A diary with pages cut out. A portrait in which the subject's eyes are subtly defiant despite her formal pose. A piece of embroidery that contains a hidden pattern, visible only when held to light. These are the testimonies of women who could not speak openly, but who left evidence anyway. They knew they were being erased. They left markers for those who would come later and know how to look. In the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, there is a collection of books once owned by women at Versailles. In the margins, generations of readers wrote notes. Some notes are devotional, some are scholarly, some are cryptic. On page 47 of a philosophical text, someone wrote, "He argues for rational self-governance. Does he mean all selves or only those born male?" On page 83 of a theological treatise, another hand wrote, "If obedience is virtue, what is autonomy? What is the word for choosing oneself?" These questions were never answered in the text. They were left there, unanswered, for future readers to find. The system ended, not because it was recognized as unjust, but because it became politically unsustainable. Absolute monarchies fell to revolution, to war, to economic transformation. The legal structures that subordinated women outlasted the monarchies that created them. France abolished absolute monarchy in 1792. French women did not gain full legal equality until 1944. That gap is not an accident. Dismantling a system of power is easier than dismantling the cultural logic that justified it. Today, historians debate the experiences of women under absolute monarchies. Some argue that noblewomen wielded significant informal power. They point to royal mistresses who influenced policy, to mothers who shaped their sons' reigns, to salonières who guided intellectual culture. This is true. Some women found leverage within the system, but leverage is not freedom. Influence exercised through male power is not autonomy. And for every woman who navigated the system successfully, there were hundreds whose names we do not know, whose letters were never delivered, whose resistance was filed under compliance achieved and forgotten. The question that remains is not historical. it is present. We live in systems now, different systems, with different mechanisms, but systems nonetheless. We are documented, surveilled, categorized. Our compliance is tracked. Our deviations are noted. We learn to perform acceptable behavior so thoroughly that we forget we are performing. We police ourselves and call it choice. We accept conditions and call it compromise. We survive by adapting to what is required, and we tell ourselves we are free because the cage has expanded and the walls are less visible. The women of Versailles were not weak. They were trapped in a system designed to eliminate every option except submission. They developed extraordinary skills of navigation, of coded communication, of strategic silence. They survived. But survival is not the same as living, and the fact that they adapted brilliantly to unbearable circumstances does not make those circumstances bearable. It only demonstrates what human beings can endure when endurance is the only currency accepted. In the archives, filed under Miscellaneous Noble Correspondence, 18th century, there is a letter from an elderly woman to her granddaughter. The woman had spent 60 years at the French court. The granddaughter was about to be married. The letter contains advice on etiquette, on managing servants, on maintaining appearances. At the very end, in handwriting that differs slightly from the rest, as though written at a different time, there are 2 sentences. They will tell you this is how things must be. Remember that must is a word men use when they mean I require it. The letter was never sent. It was found in the woman's effects after her death. The granddaughter married as planned. The system continued. The letter remains. And the question it poses remains with it. When we accept what is required of us, are we choosing survival, or are we choosing to survive in a form that makes survival itself a kind of erasure? And if we do not ask that question, who benefits from our silence?